So we have the next speaker in line in the AI track. It's Burke. She's a global investigative journalist with the Associated Press. She has been investigating power impacts of artificial intelligence in our communities. Her work has prompted federal investigations, cabinet-level resignations, and congressional hearings. She's also been honored as a Pulitzer Prize finalist for national reporting. She has received awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy John Seigenthaler Prize for Courage in Journalism. In 2019, her collaborative projects on the treatment of migrant children on the US-Mexico border were the subject of the first documentary film partnership between Frontline PBS and the AP, which won a National News and Documentary Emmy Award. Gorans also spent 2020 at the Stanford University, where she has chosen as a joint fellow by the Joint S. Knight Journalism Fellowship, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And during this fellowship, she co-created a project surfacing the role of algorithms played in government decision-making during the COVID-19. And we're really happy to continue the track by discussing what Marina initiated, the huge impact of AI in our society and how we as investigative reporters can work to cover these issues. So, and this time we will try to have a Q&A because I think there's a lot of questions raised around this topic. So I will, if you see me waving like this, it's not to be rude, it's, keep a track of time. But please, Grants, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this morning, and thanks so much to Jenny and to GIJN for bringing us together here. What a pleasure. So I'm Garance Burke. I'm a global investigative journalist with the Associated Press, and I'm going to tell you both about some stories that my team has done investigating AI, as well as a new resource that we have at the Associated Press, which we hope spurs more journalists around the world to investigate these tools and their impacts in our communities. So I am just going to start with a slide here that shows you how many people around the world are searching on Google for the term artificial intelligence. As you can see, in the last 5 years, that has gone up tremendously. This stops right around early summer this year. We had a slight drop off in interest in chatbots after that. But this just goes to show you so many of us are trying to grapple with what these technologies are, what they're doing in our world, what they mean for us personally, how they may impact our jobs, and crucially as journalists, how we can investigate these tools. I come to you from San Francisco, where all around my house there are billboards of AI companies promising that these technologies are going to revolutionize our world. OpenAI, for example, which makes ChatGPT, is less than a mile from my house. So I didn't come to AI reporting being, passionate about this just as a matter of course. I've covered many things over time. I started out as a reporter in Mexico many years ago, where I worked for a Mexican financial paper, and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe covered immigration, energy, politics, any number of things. But I think ultimately it was seeing the power of these companies and these technologies right in my hometown that led me to really want to encourage more reporters to dig into these tools, especially as these technologies scale and are applied in many different ways across the globe. So let's first just kind of break down what is artificial intelligence. So I think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that just like any other field that we investigate as journalists. This includes getting used to a new set of vocabulary words, right? So here's one, which is an algorithm, which Marina talked about a little bit earlier. Essentially, we can think of an algorithm as a set of steps that we humans give a machine system to carry out. So in very simple terms, it's like a recipe, right? It has an input, which are all of the ingredients for the dish you're going to make. Something happens inside the black box, and then an output, the dish itself. But really keep present as I'm talking that all of these AI systems are built by we humans. And so we're lucky because as journalists, that gives us multiple points of entry to investigate. So as journalists, though, we often learn by doing. So in the last couple of years, I've been leading AP's track series covering the impacts of AI on our communities. We built a lot of capacity amongst our journalists to tell these stories. We told local stories, global stories. And I'm going to tell you some about these investigations, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about more where I think we need to delve in deeper. So at AP, we have a very particular mandate. We operate in 250 locations across the world. We're a global not-for-profit cooperative, and we really need to write our stories about AI to garner a big, broad audience. We're not a specialty tech publication. So what I set about doing when I first conceived of this series was thinking about how AI tools are already showing up in so many facets of our public life across the globe. So in the track series, we had about 40 journalists all told participate. That includes a lot of journalists who were not print journalists. They came from video or photo or digital presentation backgrounds. About half were people of color, about half were women, and we just strove to tell stories that would shine a light on how these tools are impacting our communities from the most inclusive lens possible. Because just as AI is often built by a particular subset of we humans, many times it's covered by folks who don't necessarily represent the communities that they're serving. So we wanted to be very upfront about that. So one of the best ways to get into this is to look at a series that my colleague Sally Ho and I wrote that's about some predictive tools that various city and county governments are using to help decide whether children are taken from their families and sent to foster care. And there's actually some similar algorithms that are being applied to families in the UK, piloted nearby in Denmark, and also in South Korea. And in the United States, something around the order of at least 26 states and Washington, D.C. have considered using algorithms for this specific purpose. It's a really thorny area of child welfare policy, how to decide when a child may face harm in their homes, right? But little's known about how technology has been used to make these crucial decisions. And we really wanted to understand the impacts in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which happens to be where Mr. Rogers, that TV show from many years ago, was shot. And they pioneered an algorithm to make these decisions about when children should be taken from their parents and sent to foster care. Now, we didn't have access to the entire code base, but we found some academic researchers who had the data. And so that's a key lesson I want to highlight here, is that collaboration is really important. These researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, we found, had already been able to determine through analyzing years of data that for some reason in its early years, this algorithm was recommending a disproportionate number of Black families for mandatory neglect investigations. That's when a social worker comes to your home, starts investigating what's going on with the children, and that's like the first step in having a child be removed and sent to foster care. So we wanted to understand, what is this academic team finding in terms of these racial disparities? How can we do journalism around that? First, of course, we had to explain how the thing works. And I think that's another lesson here, is just being really explanatory in our journalism around AI so the public can get more insights into how this technology affects them and bring that transparency lens to the process that often is lacking. So this is how this particular tool works. It's sort of like a temperature gauge, as you can see. It basically is powered by data that the county has handed over, everything from birth records to previous records of families' involvement with the child welfare system, jail and probation records, health system records, an inordinate amount of data that the algorithm is trained on and then uses to make a judgment and spit out a score as to whether your family is low risk in the ones over in the green section or high risk over in the red 20 section. And social workers, we learned, were a little concerned about this, but county officials told us, social workers can always override the tool. And they said that the Carnegie Mellon team's research was hypothetical because there were always humans in the loop. So we wanted to make sure that we included the county's perspective, but delve a little bit deeply so that we could surface, well, what are the impacts? So my colleague Sally and I collaborated to use some open source investigative techniques to find this former foster youth, Nicolai Biddle, who had come across the algorithm when she was working for the county. And she quit in 2020 because she was worried in part about the county's use of the tool. She said that officials had dismissed her concerns, and she felt that even if the tool were built perfectly, it didn't matter because no data set, as we know as journalists, is perfect. She was concerned about some of the historical biases that this data feeding the algorithm contained. So just as you may not find a perfect data set, you may not also find a perfect character in your first go-round in writing about AI. But that allowed us to tell the public about elements of the mystery story here surrounding the use of these tools. So we spelled out that because family court hearings are closed to the public and the records are sealed, AP at first couldn't identify any families who the algorithm recommended be mandatorily investigated for child neglect. But because we took this approach of centering it on Nicolai Biddle as well as a family attorney who was really battling against trying to see the impacts of this algorithm on her clients, the story still had a lot of impact. So what happened next was child welfare officials in Oregon decided to drop their AI tool that had been modeled on the Allegheny County algorithm. They were concerned that they needed another system that would be less racially biased. Later, we published, again, when we learned that the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy had reached out to all the people we quoted in our story, and they actually published some of, some similar findings in their first ever AI Bill of Rights that the Biden administration issued, calling for more transparency around the use of these algorithms in child welfare. And then only later did we learn that the U.S. Department of Justice had actually opened up a civil rights investigation into Allegheny County's use of this algorithm, in part inspired by our reporting. So we kept going. We found that not only was there this concern about a disproportionate number of Black children being flagged for mandatory neglect investigation when compared with white kids, but we also followed up with another story that uncovered that parents with disabilities were concerned that the tool was singling them out as well. And for that, again, the theme of collaboration. We teamed up with some ACLU researchers who had access to some of the variables as well as the weights that were used in the algorithm. So the variables meaning the data points, and the weights, the way the statistical model ranked the importance of each data point in determining risk. And in delving deeper into these data points, we found even beyond the birth records and jail and probation records that we knew about, there were some really unusual ones, like ranking families on whether the mother had smoked before she was pregnant, ranking families on whether they had previously accessed county services for mental health and other behavioral health problems. ACLU found that that could add up to 3 points for a child's risk score, which from the temperature gauge you saw is a big deal if we're talking about a range of 1 to 20 on that risk score. We also, again, wanted to really focus on a family who was willing to share their story with us. So I'll just play a couple seconds of this video if we can make this work. Oh, let's see here. Not sure if this will work. Sorry, our system's a little hinky here. Can we get this? No. Okay. So this is Andrew Hackney. He has a comprehension disorder and nerve damage from a stroke that he suffered in his 20s. His wife has ADHD, and their baby girl was struggling to eat when she was an infant, and she was growing lethargic. They were very concerned. The doctor at first told them not to take her to the hospital, and then later did when she was not eating. And they believe that the medical staff alerted the child welfare system after they showed up with a baby who was dehydrated, and that's when they think their information was fed into this algorithm. Soon a social worker appeared to question them, and their daughter was sent to foster care. She's still in foster care a year and a half later. So they are also being interviewed by the U.S. Department of Justice, who's investigating now whether this algorithm has discriminated against families with disabilities like the Hackneys. So again, the focus here was to keep this really trained on who is being impacted, what are the harms if this tool doesn't work exactly as described. Of course, there are a lot of challenges with doing these kinds of stories. FOIA or public records requests aren't going to give you the entire story, right? They won't necessarily give you the human beings who we, are lucky enough to talk with as a part of our reporting. We also found that the ways in which these algorithms were implemented in the child welfare space, just as in many other policy realms, isn't centralized. Word of a good model spreads. Suddenly Denmark's considering adopting what was piloted in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. There isn't necessarily a clear line that you can follow. So you need to bring a lot of different methodologies to investigating these tools. But that's where our creativity as journalists really flourishes. If we don't get through the front door, we can kind of be like water and seep through underneath, find, former employees who are involved in building some of these tools who have concerns about them, talk to the researchers themselves, make sure that we understand the models and the statistical assumptions that they were drafted with, talk to attorneys, talk to community groups who have maybe some experience with wondering about how these surveillance or predictive tools are suddenly involved in court cases. So I think that even if there's little disclosure, we can make sure that we stay specific and that we don't go beyond the bounds of describing each particular technology, both its promise and its limitations. And that way we can hit harder with stories that are both really technically accurate as well as centered on human narratives. Because of course we as humans respond to stories. So these are some tips I have for how we can seek to do this on a broader scale. I think that narrowing the scope of inquiry is an important consideration here, whether you're reporting on this, in your specific community or across your state or country. Just being very specific about each tool is really important. So don't get overwhelmed with the idea that AI is this sort of all-seeing technology that spans industries and policy arenas. Just start small. Start with like your Allegheny County. And I do want to also share some more formal tips, which is through the Associated Press Stylebook. So some of you may know AP is, as I mentioned, a global not-for-profit cooperative. One of the things we do is every couple years we publish the AP Stylebook, which is essentially a guide to reporting. We both have entries on specific terms, language you can use, plug into your story when you're on deadline, as well as guidance and best practices about how to approach reporting on everything from climate change to race to gender, and now a new chapter on AI that I led the writing for. And what we are seeking to do here is to help write for a general global audience, including people who have zero background in AI, how they can start thinking about these tools and interrogate them on their beats. So whether you cover entertainment and are interested in why union members are striking in Hollywood over their concern about studios' use of AI-powered avatars to clone their images, or whether you cover banking and are interested in, how different mortgage rates are set for different types of people using AI. There's a set of questions now in the style book that we wrote that we hope will help you as you come up with, new ways of approaching the topics that you know so deeply. And just like we want to be transparent about algorithms, we also want to be transparent about our process at the AP Stylebook so we can do this in communities. So while I led the writing on this, this really was guided by input from a whole variety of sources. And we're going to be updating it every few months as needed. So if you have ideas about what you'd like to see in future updates of the style book, don't hesitate to get in touch. So what does this look like? So for example, here's some sample guidance. So we were talking earlier about some of this hype cycle that we're in globally around AI and it reshaping our world, or some may call it a doom loop, cycles of despair about the robots taking away our jobs. We're trying to get beyond that and just go back to journalistic basics and ask these questions about how these systems work, where they're deployed, how well do they perform, specifically as compared to humans often. Are they regulated? Often not the case. Who's benefiting and making money? And then really importantly, which communities may be negatively impacted by these tools? So my basic advice is steer clear of the esoteric debate about whether AI is good or bad, and ask how it works and what's happening under the hood. We also have some entries for what we call the top 10 dictionary definitions per se. But for example, here's one that we wrestled with for generative AI, which is the technology that powers chatbots. So here's some relatively clear, simple language that you can use to describe what chatbots do, how the generative AI powering them works, and then some of my favorite pieces of this entry are describing hallucination, this term that's used to describe the inaccurate or fabricated responses that chatbots can sometimes produce. So, there's some important guidance even in this entry here to make sure that you are being transparent with your audiences that these chatbots can also just make things up. So what's next? So I really see this work as urgent, particularly when some of these models are so complex that even those who are writing the code face challenges in describing how exactly their work is being implemented by machines. And my hope is that through pairing up, through collaborations, through doing deeper dives and investigations globally, we can bring more sunlight to this area. I will say that there are also very positive uses of AI and that AP has been a pioneer in that realm as well. We have a whole local AI initiative where news organizations are beginning to think about how to implement AI solutions to streamline some of their production processes. But for me, particularly on the editorial side, I'm really looking forward to scaling up our AI investigations globally, thinking more about, as this field evolves, how we can keep the AP Stylebook fresh to serve all of its audience, and to serve journalists in the field grappling with how to implement these new concepts in their reporting. And then we're also going to be doing some member outreach and training, as well as building on partnerships that we've started. So I just really wanted to thank our funders for some of our editorial work on the track series, the Pulitzer Center, as well as Stanford University's Starling Lab for data integrity. I think it's just fantastic to see what's been done already, and I'm very excited about the work to come. So I will definitely look forward to being in touch and hearing more about your questions. If you're interested in the track series, including some of the stories that I mentioned on child welfare, as well as some on surveillance tools that I'll be talking about on Thursday at the conference, please check out this website for the track series, and would love to stay in touch, and any questions are certainly welcome.
All right, that was very useful. Thank you so much. And now let's hit Garance with some questions. What do you want to know?
Don't be shy. If you've never, even thought about a chatbot or, taken a statistics class, this is absolutely the beat for you.
We have a question up here.
So thank you so much for this. My question is not necessarily related to what you've spoken about, but I'm wondering, are there aspects of what you're doing that is related to tracking how AI and, how AI essentially impacts on press freedom? I'm just curious. Or if anybody in the hall has been thinking around that, how is it impacting on safety of journalists and generally press freedom issues?
No, I think that's a great question, because of course, in our investigations of surveillance tools, for example, some of the facial recognition tools that are powered by AI, under the hood, we found that those, of course, are used against journalists, right? So I think that that's why really getting an understanding of how these systems work, and then how they can be deployed in settings other than what they were originally intended for, is really important. That's been something that I know journalists in Ukraine have worried about. I know Carlos Dada in El Salvador, who leads El Faro there, told me that he had a drone come up to his window, right? At one point, unclear why. So I think that just being really really open to learning about how these systems work, whether you're talking about surveillance or predictive tools, is important. And then also being very careful about mapping your own threat circles while you're doing so is really crucial. So I think that, consulting with some of the folks who are here from Citizen Lab and other organizations that monitor these kinds of technologies and how they can be weaponized against press freedom while we're here is a fantastic idea. But yeah, I think it's been very instructive for me to take a look at, for example, how some tools that were put into place under COVID, ostensibly to track people's health, were then later repurposed to follow activists around and harass marginalized communities. We did another story actually completely on that in the track series that I'll present on Thursday, and that was very instructive to just think about, oh my goodness, I just thought this was supposed to monitor our body temperatures, and here it's being, deployed in all over the world for different purposes.
I'm Minna from the Finnish Broadcasting Company. Thank you for your interesting talk and very important work. A question, do you have experience of doing freedom of information, trying to get the algorithms through the Freedom of Information Act like the Dutch did?
Yeah, I think that story is so fantastic because it's just motivating for all of us to see that every now and then it does work, right? FOIA is just so imperfect. We could have a whole therapy session, I feel like, at this conference where we all talk about how hard it is to wait for those documents, and then the sort of inevitable disappointment when they come mostly fully redacted. But I think that the folks at Lighthouse Reports really hit on a wonderful stroke of luck when they got that training data. We have not gotten the training data when we have sought it necessarily. So I think that's why coming at this from a variety of different methodologies is important in case your FOIA doesn't work out, right? And I think that there's also all kinds of ways in which the builders of these systems can claim that this information is proprietary. We've gotten all sorts of documents marked confidential through other means. And some of this, it's like you wonder how this confidentiality claim can really be made in the first place. But there's new ways in which developers can say, if we were to reveal this, it would really limit our market share, right? Or there are contracts with government agencies that are made in a sort of a fashion that allows for non-disclosure. So I think that certainly consulting with lawyers for how to build the best FOIA strategy and then litigate it is a good idea, but just keep in mind all of this rich panoply of methodologies that we have as journalists and, be creative.
Hi, thanks for that. So you mentioned in your presentation historical biases in data, which I found really interesting, but I wonder, how do you avoid being misled by these historical biases when you use AI tools?
Oh, so you're thinking about like if you are applying it in your journalism?
Yeah, or eventually the outcome of your project will have to tackle these historical biases that you will find in your data set.
Right.
So, and then how do you train, or how do you maybe manipulate the AI tool so that you are not misled by, because when you look at the data, it will eventually go all the way back, and then so that you come up with a proper analysis.
No, that's a very thoughtful question. Absolutely. Thank you. I think that here, just getting a real grounding in how these models work is an important first step. So AI tools are powered by what's often referred to as training data. So whether that's a chatbot that learns from vast reams of text on the internet, including, some of the very work that we as news organizations publish, as well as conspiracy theories and, Reddit forums. You really want to understand the training data that powers these chatbots before accepting what they spit out to you as actually being factual, right? If it's trained on conspiracy theories, how can that be, something you would want to rely on, right? But I think that if you're using AI in your reporting, you would want to really think a lot about what is in your data set that you're using it on and what may be excluded from your data set. So for example, I'm thinking of the Marshall Project in the United States. They did a really interesting application of machine learning to go through reams of documents that they had to generate summaries, sort of short text, explanatory text about what each document contained, which seemed to me to be like a really good use of machine learning, taking away a rote task that we as humans otherwise would have to slog through, but they knew exactly what the training data was. In that case, it was thousands of PDFs, right? So they weren't particularly concerned that there would be bias that would show up there. But if you are, say, gaining access to like policing data, I don't know which nation you're from, but in the United States, there's certainly an overrepresentation of communities of color in most arrest records. And if you're looking at the arrest records data, you would very much want to be aware of that historical overrepresentation of communities of color and factor that into your analysis, right? So there again, pairing up with data scientists, pairing up with academic experts who are familiar with some of the pitfalls of each data set you're interested in working on is going to be really important. So not sort of feeling like you have to grapple with this alone, but bringing in others who you can consult with, I think, is a great strategy.
We have a question up here.
Hey, thank you. You mentioned the project with the government algorithm, which is a very easy, well, not an easy story, but it's a story that could be in any country in the world. And also you mentioned the COVID data misuse later on. Is there any other field that you feel that people in any country could do a story in that's underreported but actually full of stories? Thank you.
No, that's a great question. And I think that, this is such a rich target area. That's another thing that I love about reporting on AI. So often our journalism is way ahead of any regulation. And so as we saw with our reporting on child welfare, no one had really looked at this with a critical lens before, right? And then there it shows up in the Biden administration's AI Bill of Rights, and the Justice Department is suddenly interested, right? So if you do really technically accurate reporting, having a policy response is much more possible, I think. But listen, there's AI-powered tools that are used in making decisions about who gets public housing. There are AI-powered tools that are used in determining insurance rates. There are AI-powered tools that are used in modeling emissions for climate change in power plants. AI is used in the entertainment industry. It's increasingly used in education and in hiring decisions. There's been some great, really high impact reporting about how people with disabilities or who present differently from the majority when facial recognition tools are used are then disadvantaged by those AI tools that will suddenly, decide that because you have a facial tic or, you have a speech impediment that you are a terrible job candidate, right? Again, that's something that the Department of Justice in the United States is now looking into. But I think that there are ways that these models kind of show up across national boundaries in a sort of a surprising way. And so actually looking to some of the reporting that someone else has done in a country far from yours could end up being a good way to think about how you can localize these stories, because it's such a cutting edge field that the data scientists themselves are going, oh, well, they did that, in South Korea, that predictive policing experiment. Why don't we try it in Germany?
Yeah.
Yes, hello. My name is Emil Ditzel. I'm from TV2 Denmark. I just wondered, because you said that Denmark was inspired by some of the projects that you covered. Are those the same companies that offers the same tools that are being used in Denmark as well, or who are the companies behind these solutions?
Forgive me, I forget the exact name of the university in Denmark, but I can look it up for you. This was a situation in which one of the developers of the Allegheny County algorithm was advising a group of academic researchers in Denmark on a pilot program that had some similar elements to this Pennsylvania algorithm. was again trying to predict which children would face harm in their homes. My understanding is that that was then shelved.
Okay.
But
Interesting. Yeah.
might be interesting to look into it.
Always is, right? Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, happy to talk about it more if you find me later.
I think we have one in the white shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is Ajibola Hamzat. I work for the CCIJ. Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in knowing your thoughts about the ethics of AI in academic writing. I know you are not an academic, but I'd like to know what you think. Thank you.
Oh no, this is a big topic, right? I have some friends who are professors who are getting essays handed into them that are, they later find out written by ChatGPT. I mean, I think every university and high school around the world is probably going to find this. Students relying on AI-powered technologies to help them do research. And I think it's going to be something that, we're going to really have to grapple with as a society around, whether that's appropriate. I think it's somewhat inevitable. So each institution will have to make its own rules. But I also think that there's some more interesting journalistic work to be done there around AI-powered tools that are being used on students, to determine who's cheating. There were some of these tools that were implemented during the pandemic when all kids were remote and on screens in many countries. Again, like measuring people's facial movements to determine which children were cheating on exams, or surveillance tools that are now present in educational settings, sometimes to determine whether kids have guns. Maybe it turns out later, the child was just like taking something else out of their pocket, and now they're in a whole process in the criminal justice system that nobody could have intended. So I think that it's important to think about both how these tools are being deployed as well as being used by students and teachers. I don't know if that answers your question, but happy to talk more.
One final question, lady in the front here, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Adeni Kialoba, Data Fight Nigeria. I'm curious, at its most simplistic, AI and the machine learning that powers it takes existing data. And I'm wondering, how is querying and questioning the biases contained in this data, what's that? Because there seems to be a blurred line between attempting to change history by questioning, is it the data that is inaccurate, or does it open up a whole vista of rethinking how a nation has developed, how a country has developed, and why that system exists? It feels as if it may just not be enough to say, oh, that data is inaccurate because of biases. It feels as if we have to question almost, there's a development opportunity. I just don't know how we're thinking about it. How we don't come to a place where it feels as if we're rewriting history in an attempt to sort of I'm looking for the English word now, in an attempt to kind of limit the biases that we get from some of these data that is powering AI. But how do we just kind of navigate that gray line between not attempting to change history, because all of the content we have produced, all of the reportage that we've done is what is powering this learning. So how do we introspect on where our societies are without attempting to say, oh, AI is making a mistake, so we're correcting that mistake? How are we not whitewashing history?
No, that's such an interesting question. And I think that what's also interesting about this field is that it forces you to go down these rabbit holes to understand previous policies and how they may have influenced those data sets. And so I would just be really interested to hear more about in Nigeria, if there are any particular policy arenas that you're looking at where there's overrepresentation of particular groups of people and AI has now come in, what that could end up looking like? You know, I think in the United States, as I was saying before, there's certainly an overrepresentation of communities and families of color in child welfare data. And so that took us on a history research project, right? To understand the ways in which, you know, Black children are overrepresented in these systems, you know, what kinds of policies led to that, what, you know, the current administration is seeking to do around that, while at the same time supporting the development of some of these AI tools that could possibly harden these biases into the system. So it's very complicated. And I think that, you know, just like with any project where you delve into data, it's so important to think about who is included in the data set and who is not, and why that's the case. Like in the case of policing data, certainly in many, you know, countries in the industrialized world, again, neighborhoods of color would be overrepresented in arrest records, whereas, you know, white collar crimes might not be so present in, or white collar criminals rather, might not be so present in those arrest records. So I think it's a complex set of questions to bring to bear, and very much worth it to explore sort of the full life cycle of this data, why it is the way it is from the jump, and then where it gets to once AI is introduced. And that's a rich vein to tap, particularly with outside collaborators such as academics and data scientists again. And of course, experts on those beats in your newsroom.
Garance, I think your talk has proven that AI is an issue that we all need to own. I mean, regardless of if we, you know, are interested in the technology, it's clearly part of policy making and power orders that affects us all. So yeah, and a lot of good tips as well. So I hope you will follow us after lunch as well. We will continue this discussion. And yeah, thank you so much for your speak.
Thank you so much.